So what I've tried to do in this overview is to give you a fair-minded but encouraging, indeed optimistic picture of where we are across the world. And to cut a long story short, our strong sense is that the rhetoric is getting really good and the practice has quite a long way to go to catch up with it. So that, if you want a spoiler alert, the theme of the day, it'll be that we're going with the grain, but not everybody has caught up with us, and sometimes colleagues, very understandably, in the real world of teaching in busy schools, have so many other pressures and are not yet feeling confident or capable enough to do some of the things that we're talking about. Some of what I'm going to show you, if you were in Paris, is similar or even identical, and some of it isn't, because I'll be testing you on the bits that weren't. And I want to put the focus today in what I'm saying on 10 practical takeaways. And just to give you a hint before I get there, and then you can note them as we go through and see whether they resonate for you. The first is about what I'm calling split screen teaching. The second is all about thinking about progression. Whatever we say is creativity or creative thinking, what does it look like for a 5-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 15-year-old, and so forth? The third is really making our commitment to this visual and overt within a school landscape. The other piece of paper that kids have is a rectangular timetable. And that's a dominating force in many people's minds. Short, atomized bits of subject learning, important, we're not saying not that, but how do you make creativity visible? Then something about mapping it against the core subjects in your curriculum, indeed all subjects, ultimately. Creativity is ubiquitous, it knows no bounds. Of course it sits in the arts, but not only in the arts. It sits in science and maths, and geography and the humanities, and it sits outside the school in the community. To focus, if you're a school leader sitting in this room, and several of you are, on, and forgive me if I put it quite like this, the enormity of the challenge. It's not like, well, we'll just introduce a new reading book to year 5, or even we'll think about a different approach to phonics. This is quite a mindset shift for some colleagues, so just recognizing this. That'll require 6th point, different pedagogies, 7th point, different approaches to assessment, especially formative assessment. It'll require us to evidence all that, I'm going to suggest, in student portfolios, increasingly digital. You don't want to be a level 3B of creative thinking, indeed, but you want to have the whole span, the whole arc of evidence to be able to share with others. And that puts students right in the driving seat of this process. And then as a school leader, again, to stand back and say, okay, how am I going to make this journey over 2, 3, 4, 5 years? This is not a quick fix. This is not about, well, we're a bit worried that there aren't enough important issue as this is, girls going into engineering. That's a really important issue, but it's of a slightly different scale in some ways, maybe not, you can discuss. And finally, in the time-honored fashion, to model this, to be the change that we want to see happen. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So everything, we are the predominant role models in the space. If we say we value curiosity, but actually we keep tamping it down, the kids will spot that. That's the hidden curriculum of creative thinking in schools. What we say and what we actually do, and we'll be toggling between that. So why have I got a map of the world like that? Well, because once upon a time, that was the best that geographic science could give us. And if you sail from London down to Sydney, hypothetically, you'd fall off the edge and be bitten on your journey, on your way by that creature lurking underneath. That's a bit of an image for how we've developed the learning sciences. Once upon a time, we thought that kids came to school and we filled them up with stuff and then we moved them on to the next stage. It isn't like that. Great thinking is a critical part of these other capabilities. What I'm describing is a move from the 3 R's to the 3 C's. The 3 C's, in my head at least, are creative thinking, collaboration, and communication. Increasingly with a focus on oracy. So much of our exam system reliant on pencil and timed parades of recall. We need, of course, to do much more than that. So, headlines. If you're interested, this is page 43, just before the notes section. Doing really well, so a kind of green, dial right over, if you like, 4 out of 5 on the status. Doing pretty well in terms of understanding and seeing it in the curriculum and thinking about curriculum design, culture, and pedagogies, making progress. And later on, we'll be hearing from a colleague at the OECD, with whom we've been delighted to be doing work on fostering and assessing curriculum creative thinking. And then finally, we think professional learning, what we've gathered together today to do. There's a lot of work to do. It's almost invisible in the pre-service university courses across the world. There are some honourable exceptions. Michael Anderson's University at Sydney is an honourable exception. There are a few great examples in the UK, but it's not widespread. And definitely when you get to in-service professional learning, lots and lots to do. Welcome, friends. Hope you have a really brilliant day. I'm Bill Lucas, and just introducing the overview report. So in terms of the status, we might choose to honour the late Sir Ken Robinson in reminding ourselves that not in everybody's mind, certainly not the politicians, but there is a real shift towards the vision that Ken had. And you can see it in some of the common models of curriculum, whether you're looking at the World Economic Forum or in the States, the Centre for Curriculum Redesign. Conscious that's a bit of an angle for you, so do feel free if it's awkward to move. And that goes to any colleague here. We're all grown-ups, aren't we? So if you can't get what you need, please move so you can get what you need. The Brookings Institution has been monitoring this over time. And interestingly, when you focus on what they're, so I've crunched the 4 C's into 3 C's, you'll see, because it's kind of like the ring of 3 R's and 3 C's. And because 4's too many, 4's not a brilliant number. 3 is much easier to remember. You'll see that it's strong on rhetoric, not yet strong enough in practice. That's the summary that I take from that report. Now clicking, what could possibly go wrong? And now clicking, clicker, and something's happening. Back in 2012, we were commissioned by Creativity, Culture and Education. It's great there's a colleague from that organisation here today to look at what was going on in the world of creativity and see if we could develop a school-based model of that. That is the model. Some of you are familiar with it and using it. Just south of the river here in London, Thomas Tallis School, doing amazing things in that regard. And a really strong example of how you can visualise this and get that out there. It's in every classroom, it's in corridors, it's in the staff room, it's part of professional induction. But as well as all the things you expect to be doing, you're also doing that as well. The OECD took up that model and commissioned and we wrote a working paper, and that's now landed in schools across the world. A lot of schools, actually, a lot of countries, more than 30 countries now using this, not throughout, but in parts of their curriculum practice. I think there are 2 really powerful things going on where we're delighted to be partners with the OECD on this. One is the serious research work that you're going to hear some of the fruits from later on, and that's the work on the left there. Pretty much everything we'll show you is free to wear, so you can download it later. And on the right, if you want to Google that, it's a really nice overview of the PISA Creative Thinking test, beginning to suggest what you might be able to take from it. A 1-hour online test of 15-year-olds is interesting in terms of status, but not ultimately interesting in terms of what we do in classrooms and corridors and workshops and studios. So you'll find some of the early thinking that we've been doing there, how we can turn this into a suite of formative assessment tools, ultimately. So if we're looking at curriculum, and here I'm going to go really quickly. In the report, there's an A to Z of countries, some 23 different countries and jurisdictions. Here, just a few. I'm going to stop at the letter F to give you something to do on the train or wherever it is later on. Australia very much led the way here. Lots of really nice embedding to a national curriculum body that says here is what curriculum creative thinking is. There's a synonym for creative thinking. Here's how it sits in this axis, web and web, within subject disciplines and all the other things that you might do. They're calling it a capability. I think I'd call it a set of habits of mind or dispositions. Doesn't matter. We're amongst friends. The language will change, but that's the kind of thing. It's more complex. It's not a subject. Or it is a subject. It's more like, as Andreas Schleicher was saying yesterday, thinking like a scientist, or thinking like somebody who's being creative. It's a set of habits of mind that intersect with knowledge. We're not saying knowledge doesn't matter. Knowledge is foundational. You can't do stuff without that. But if you think about an axis, knowledge over there, dispositions over there, the connective tissue is skills, creative skills. I may know how to tie my shoelace or Velcro if that's what I do, but then I have to be able to do it. So it's that movement from knowing something and then being able to do it routinely, and ultimately, this is a deeper learning message, in context with which I'm unfamiliar. So learning transfer. That's what we want to get happening in schools. If you want just to dig deeper into that Australian idea of the web and weft, the idea we use, take-home point 1, is of split-screen teaching. Today we're going to be focusing on the history of Australia, and at the same time we'll be using our critical thinking muscles, as it were, because much of it is written by Brits and they're deeply unreliable. Or it takes no real understanding of the original home nations and their values and cultures. Or today we're going to be looking at English example, history, at the Tudors, famous subject in primary schools, and we'll need to be using our empathy and our ability to understand that what we see in the history books is not what the serfs and villeins were actually experiencing. So we're locking in subject, knowledge, and program study with an aspect of creative thinking. So, moving on, if you were now thinking to yourself, well, how do I do that? The answer is messily. And the answer is curriculum co-design and co-planning. There is no escape. So if somebody says to you, well, I can't do that, I'm too busy, and you say, I'll never do that, that won't work. Well, of course you won't allow them to say that, but they will need time. And they will need time to sit down and to agree what your model is and to cross-map it. I think that's a no-brainer. Take home 2, not only do you need to decide what it is, here's the state of Victoria's definition of curriculum creative thinking, or creative thinking in my language, you need to start to map it. Here is their progression document. It's in the back of your report, so if you want to have a look at that, as is the Australian model, if you want to have a look at that. Australian model, a bit more complex. I think the state of Victoria has done that common sense thing for all teachers. If it's important, stick it on the side of A4. Because if we do that, it's going to happen. If it's too much stuff to do to read, it just will not happen. And here's another lovely example of a very much a partner school to Thomas Tallis. They've been moving in very similar directions, both in challenging areas of a wonderful city. This is Ruddy Hill High School, known to Michael and colleagues in Australia, led by an extraordinary principal, Chris Gorty, who are and have been doing wonderful things here. Again, this visibility there. I was in the library with Zane, and you can see it's there. It's there wherever you look in the school. Quick, rapid zoom now around a few countries, and we're going to start in Canada and a state, because in some countries the national body sets the tone. This is like Canada and Australia, and to a certain extent the states, and then local districts or a local state says, well, actually, that's maybe what you say in Canberra, but here in Melbourne, we're going to do something slightly different. And in Canada, wonderful state of Alberta, take home 4, do this cross-mapping really systematically and make it available to colleagues and probably enter it through a kind of competence level. If you get too far down in the weeds, you'll get dragged. So just think about, how as a school are you going to frame it? Are you going to use the 3 C's? Are you going to have something that connects to your school's values? Are you going to be thinking about making this Ofsted-proof, in which how are you going to do it, basically? And then how are you going to systematically, rigorously cross-map it? The Durham Commission, which I was proud and pleased to be part of, published its report in 2019. England was arising from a very long sleep in the slow lane. I speak to my English friends here. Really, frankly, since 1999, when Ken Robinson's Nazi report was published, and a brief flowering of imagination in the first decade of this century with personal learning and thinking skills, we've been increasingly pushed to the margins, and we're increasingly shouting and stamping our feet. And the Durham Commission, its primary recommendation was, well, fund schools to figure out what works. So 8 clusters of schools, some of them, I'm delighted to say, I can see London and the Northwest represented on this front table here. Do talk to them. Fantastic work going on here, where in a professional learning community context, 8, then 10, then 20, then a number of schools are figuring out how this works in a busy English national curriculum. Some 10,000 pupils involved in this, so this is a big data set being externally evaluated by Durham University. Really excited. Other things going on in England too. If you've not seen the Creativity Exchange, we're just revamping at the moment. 1,001 things that you want to be able to do and know as a teacher and put into practice in your classroom tomorrow. That's what we're trying to do on the Creativity Exchange. And here's just a quick overview, which you can't possibly see because it's a relatively small screen. It's a lovely sunny day and you're sitting way over there. But if you Google Creativity Collaboratives, you can have a look yourself. And they're spread right across the country. And here we've got a colleague from the Northeast here today. And they're deciding, see, this is about regional branding too. They want to be visible within their educational jurisdiction. I think that's fantastic. There is their brand. You can see it's, broadly speaking, taking our 5 habits. And we're going to hear more about this later on, but some wonderful work going on in China. We're going to have, as I say, nothing can go wrong, can it? We're going to have a live feed hearing about 2 districts that have been doing amazing work at Jiading and Pudong. And really looking forward to that, and that will be facilitated on the ground here. Here's Finland, the poster boy or girl of the English, Maths, Science type PISA tests, really nailing this as being something fundamentally important and something that's probably interdisciplinary. So, there's great movement. I've only got to the letter F. You can scan the rest of this in the report and read your way through this. Take home 5. There's lots of stuff we're beginning to understand about the culture, about how you teach, and then I'm going to get to how you assess. There is a culture shift. Just take a moment to look at that. And just think about your own school, and think about the degree to which you are happy to frame things as authentic problems, or whether you're more in that transmissive didactic space, which we partly have to be part of the time. To what degree you see this as a social act, or is it still largely individual? To what extent are you opening up opportunities for either inter or transdisciplinary work, as we were saying? Pam Bernard was reminding us we needed to think yesterday. And where possibly, what role for kids? How much are we letting them into this space to be co-designers? If you lay those kind of principles out into a slightly longer list, here are the kind of things. This is a great entry-level professional learning activity that you can do with your staff back at home and say, okay, if there's a continuum here which has always on the right and never on the left, how are we doing? And when we're marking ourselves as always, what does it look like? What's going on when we're doing that? And when we're over on the left, what is it holding us back? Remember my founding kind of metrics, what's going well, what's holding us back? And then we're going to find some solutions as we emerge today. Some of you will be familiar with that. It's taken from Teaching Creative Thinking. It's synthesis of some of the great work we know about this, going back a lot to a number of our late and much-loved friend Anna Craft's work on this, which was, I think you and I would agree, foundational in her sense of possibility thinking. That's what we're really about. So here's our mapping of signature pedagogies against different desired outcomes as part of being a good creative thinker. Here's some wonderful work that we'll hear more about later on. Just age of about 14 we identified in the SERI research. And here's a kind of staff room language that's more like the kind of thing you might be saying if you were chatting over a cup of tea or coffee with your colleagues in your staff. Nearly there. 4 minutes, because I'm going to ask others to keep to time, I need to keep to time. So forgive me if I'm gambling a little bit, but I'm sure you'll go with me. So the dial is getting a little bit redder at this stage, but there are really exciting moments. One of the most weird things that I remember as a researcher was when Guy Claxton and I took some of our early material into schools and said, these are schools already doing great stuff. We'd like you to help us think about how best we could evidence, or if we didn't say evidence, we said assess this. Fatal mistake. They virtually left in droves. They said, you can't be doing this, you cannot be serious. You know, creativity is what it is to make it to be human. And gradually we had a conversation, we had a light bulb moment, Guy and I, on the train on the way back, because we'd given them a list. And that was the circle, the birth of the circle. What about if we put all these things that we all agree value in a circle and didn't say that's better than that? And what about if we shift the language away from measure and assess to evidence? That would be my strong advice. How do we get better at evidencing progression? Then you don't have to call on Maya Angelou to remind you that the great thing about creativity is the more you do, the more you do. It's not a kind of vanishing resource, so it's a really optimistic message. Australia In particular, the state of Victoria has been doing this since 2015. I was proud to be in at the birth of that. And they have wonderful online, authentic, they look like and feel like games. In fact, they're so much in demand by 15-year-olds, they had to quarantine them because kids keep wanting to play. Well, what a wonderful bringing together of assessment, curriculum, progression, and pedagogy. We've got to bring these sometimes disparate groups back together. PISA is doing fantastic work. The Australian Council for Educational Research is doing fantastic work. We're just launching a project here in England. If anybody's interested, talk to me now today, because we're just closing the door on the enrolment, looking for schools wanting to pilot this in their school. We need at least 4 teachers and a commitment from the head to make this happen. PD, professional learning starting this term, we're off from January next year. Lots of work that you could draw on. Here's some work I've been doing with colleagues in Western Australia. Flooding the system. If you think of a field guide metaphor, and that this is not something you can tie down, but you need lots of ways of evidencing, of capturing the wonderful thing kids are doing. Very small children can talk very thoughtfully and reflectively about what they're doing and their progress. And we sometimes forget that. Oh, all of this is alive and well in the early years. It kind of goes under the ground in primary. It becomes invisible in secondary. And if you're lucky in a college or university, it resurfaces. And you think, what the heck were we doing? How do we let that atomized version of life and learning take place? In Australia, there's a national recommendation to have a profile. We've made a similar recommendation here, we being Rethinking Assessment. We were delighted, we had Rachel Sylvester, the chair of the Times Education Commission, with us in Paris yesterday. It was one of her main findings. We know it's finding traction with the political parties. Who do you think is going to be in power then? Peter Hyland, remember him? He was the co-founder of this with me. He's now in Keir Starmer's office. So we're writing some manifestos and we're optimistic that they might come to pass. If you do a find and replace, you'll see the word creativity at least 40 times in that report. So to conclude, this is what we're about today. Professional learning, sharing of ideas, really stimulating each other to use evidence, to change hearts, to change minds, and to do things quite dramatically differently. It's a challenge, and the extent of the leadership challenge, I've tried to summarise with colleagues Louise Stoll and Alan Spencer in that report. Again, all free to air, you can get that from the Creativity Exchange. So really, if you're a leader sitting here, just starting to frame here's what we're doing in year 1, here's what we're doing in year 2, year 3, having an action plan and having some metrics, some qualitative, some harder, that you can just in a nice way call yourself to account of. That's what Scotland does at a national level, that's what Creative Ireland does at a national level. States and countries taking this seriously, that's what they do. So there's the summary, and my last point is of course that we need to role model and be the kind of things that we're talking about. So there's the summary. If that's of interest to you, then we'll make sure that we share these takeaway points and indeed share the slides. It's been fantastic talking to you. I'm only 30 seconds on my timing, which is not bad. So thank you. You may give yourself a round of applause.